Shelley, welcome back. This has become, these videos we've been doing, somewhat akin to the Game of Thrones, except we're dealing with baseline Mansionization Ordinance. But like before every episode of Game of Thrones, they do a recap. Mm-hmm. Let's recap. Let's just wind us back and go to the beginning.
Okay, good idea. Maybe I'll even preface it by saying, for anyone who hasn't quite thought about it this way, that mansionization isn't actually about big houses. Mansionization is about houses that are big for their setting. So it's really a question of proportion, not a question of sort of sheer size. And that is the crux of the problem, because there's been a proliferation of houses that are so large relative to their setting that they really impose on their neighbors, they're a burden on their neighbors, and they disrupt the feel and the look of a neighborhood. So the city finally took action a little late in the game in 2008 and enacted baseline Mansionization Ordinance. Then in 2011, they passed the corresponding hillside Mansionization Ordinance because it recognized that there were different issues in hillsides. Sadly, neither worked at all, and mansionization not only continued, it mushroomed. So, in 2014, Councilmember Paul Koretz, bless his heart, stepped up to the plate with a council motion to amend the baseline ordinances, and he had very straightforward ideas, very to the point. There were a bunch of loopholes that are mostly to do with bonuses and exemptions, that is square footage that simply doesn't get counted. That, of course, all on top of a pretty generous ratio to begin with. Mm-hmm. And I'll even kind of sidestep for a moment here and say, again, for people who haven't been immersed in this, that most zoning, including the regulations on the size of homes, is done on the basis of proportion. So it's a question of what is the square footage of the house relative to the square footage of the lot. That's the floor area ratio that you hear about over and over and over.
Mm-hmm. So but simply just means what percentage of the lot, of the land, can be house.
Right.
Yeah.
So we started out with a ratio that was a little too big to begin with, and then added on a bunch of bonuses and layered on exemptions, and by the time you're done, voila, there is your McMansion. Mm-hmm. The motion went in 2014, and there was a lot of throat clearing in the city, and hiring issues, and budgeting issues, and being in queue, and the first draft of amendments came out in October last year. And I think most people who were pushing for reform of the ordinance felt that it made quite a good start. It had some shortcomings, but it made a good start. It seemed to be headed in the right direction. The city had hearings. We talked about the areas where we thought it could be improved a little bit. They went into a second draft, which came out in April, and to everybody's surprise or consternation or something, it seemed to go off on a tangent, reinstating some of the loopholes that we got rid of in the first place, introducing elements that are called design standards, which were kind of lifted from a different, larger planning project, and the concern is that they have the effect of making the ordinance more complicated, harder to enforce, easier to game, whatever. So again, they had hearings and took testimony and letters and response of all kind, and a lot of people said, hey, could we go back closer to your earlier draft, closer to the motion that set this whole thing in process in the first place? Let's clean it up, let's keep it simple, and let's make sure that it's a meaningful change. Out of that process, the planning department put together a staff report, and that staff report just went this week before the city Planning Commission for the first hearing. And again, kind of to keep the big picture, it didn't do a lot of what we were asking for. It did have some good moves. There was a little bit more transparency. They tightened some of the definitions. They brought down some of the allowances. Some good things. But one really hot button issue, pretty much from the beginning, has been the exemption for attached garages, and that was still in there.
I saw that.
Right. So a whole lot of commotion about that. A long hearing, which I must say was done very professionally. The Planning Commission President, David Ambrose, is absolutely to be commended for his patience and his professionalism and so forth. At any rate, at the end of the day, we ended up with a vote to put the amendment next before the city's Planning, Land Use Management, or PLUM committee, more or less as is, with one significant difference, and that is virtually everyone who spoke in favor of stopping mansionization talked about closing the loophole for the attached garages, and the commissioners did hear that message loud and clear. However, there wasn't unanimity on the commission, so they ended up with a compromise which will still leave uncounted square footage, not all of it, but some of it, but does create incentives for putting the attached garage at the back, which means that you won't be looking at the garage doors in older neighborhoods. That's really out of character, and you will need a driveway to get there, which creates a nice buffer. So that was a good move. A few other points did not get the attention that people had hoped. Hillside folks wanted change in terms of the allowances for grading and hauling.
That's
there
a
was
big
no
issue
change.
up there.
Big issue up there. Those who live in the larger single-family zones, the RA, RS, RE, wanted to eliminate the bonuses that have been eliminated in the smaller zones, the R1 zones. That didn't happen. So there are still some open items, but kind of big picture, we are in a better place than we were. And if the amendments as they stand today were enacted as they are, we would see a very substantial improvement in terms of houses being much more in scale with their neighborhood and more in keeping with the character of the neighborhood.
Didn't they also reduce the percentage that you were allowed of the lots you were allowed to build on?
Yes,
Wasn't
the
it 50?
FAR,
Yeah.
the FAR for R1 zones is down, which is very important. And again, the R1 zones are a very big proportion of the total single-family lots in the neighborhood, rather in the city, and they are the ones that really have been pinched in that they're relatively smaller lots. A lot of them are around 6,000 square feet, 7,000, some 5,000. So you just don't have a whole lot of elbow room.
So these recommendations that came out this week
Yes.
would take it from 50% of a lot to 40.
To 45, right. And then there will still be some uncounted square footage, but not a lot. In the R1 zones, most of that has been eliminated, so it's a big improvement.
Clarify one thing. So if it's an attached garage in the front, rather than being able to deduct 400 square feet from your calculations,
Right.
they're now advocating that you can take half of that, 200.
Right.
But if the garage is detached or attached to the rear of the house,
Right.
you're still allowed to take.
The full 400.
Okay.
So they haven't really addressed the issue of the bulk that's added by that garage. But again, you won't see the garage from
Out
the
of sight,
street.
out of mind.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah.
And again, so for the older neighborhoods, pre-war, et cetera, that's a big issue. That's a key element of the character of the neighborhoods, and you get the driveway. So it's a far from
And
perfect.
would you know off the top of your head what is the minimum width of a driveway? Would it be
I'm
8?
thinking it's around 12, but I don't know whether that's,
Right.
it may be smaller than that.
So that when you're given the setbacks that you have to follow,
Right.
and then the width of that, so it does really add,
It does
that driveway
make a
really
difference.
adds a
Yes.
buffer.
It's a break,
Mhm.
like a pause.
No, I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay.
Because all this gets a little confusing, and
Right.
particularly when I saw they're going to allow you to deduct 400 square feet, but now I understand why. It's to incentivize people putting the garages in the back of the property or attaching it to the rear of
Right.
the house.
Right.
Very
Again,
good.
you know, if we had a magic wand, anything to do with that exemption would
Yeah.
be gone. But we're going to move forward at this point. I believe that most of the people who have been fighting for reform are really going to concentrate on big picture.
And just to clarify, this meeting this week was the City Planning Commission, and that's composed of appointees of Mayor Garcetti's?
Yes, that's right.
And then next is going to a committee of city council members.
Right.
Mhm.
The Planning Land Use Management Committee will consider this before it goes to the full.
Because the end of this process is it goes to the full city council
That's right.
for an up and down,
That's right.
up or down vote.
Right. And meanwhile, there's an environmental review that's, I believe, ongoing as we speak.
Now do we know when that will be completed?
Speaking for myself, I do not know. Soon, we hope.
Well, that would delay the vote then in the council?
Potentially it could, but it is underway. And it
Okay.
should be fairly straightforward because downsizing houses has tremendous environmental benefits.
Yes.
You have
Yeah.
less debris, less material,
Mhm.
less energy consumption, less permeable land being covered,
Mhm.
less runoff, less damage to mature street trees. Pretty much.
Yeah,
less
that's a
of
good
debris.
point, and that's a point in all of our previous episodes we never really covered, was the environmental impact
Oh, yes.
of
and-
Mansionization.
Oh, and it's very substantial, and it absolutely flies in the face of the city's sort of overarching objective of being a more sustainable city. So you have a bigger house that does nothing whatsoever to address density issues because it's still a single-family house. It not only does nothing to address affordability issues, it works in the wrong direction because you'd be tearing down a relatively more affordable house and replacing it with a showplace
Yes.
that, you know, a speculator hopes to really cash in on. And while you're at it, you are consuming more material and more energy, putting a greater strain on the city's infrastructure, things like that.
Yeah, because there's obvious exceptions to this, but from the statistics I'm reading, you've got fewer and fewer household members per house these days than ever before. So you can have a McMansion and maybe have a family of 3.
Oh, very,
living
very
there.
often the case.
It's not a case
Right.
of somebody with, very few people have 5, 6, 7 children anymore.
Right. Now, you'll hear the argument put forth by speculators that we need bigger houses because we have multi-generational families and so on and so forth. All right. It is true that in the experience of most neighborhoods that have been mansionized, that isn't really happening, but it's really a red herring in any case
Yeah.
because it's irrelevant. You have a larger family, you cannot go to your neighbor and raid his refrigerator because you have more mouths to feed.
Right.
So
Yes.
you're also not entitled to his light and his air and his privacy so that you can house this multi-generational family in grand style.
And we already have an accessory dwelling unit
Right.
ordinance that allows granny flats, so you can add a second floor to your garage or build an accessory building in your backyard, and that's pretty much by right. It's pretty liberal, but that's another Oprah. We'll get into that another time. But there's already a pressure relief valve
There is.
there. Much like Game of Thrones, in any good drama, you have obstacles. So given where we're at right now, what are the obstacles or challenges ahead?
Well, as you would of course imagine, speculators. So you have developers and you have realtors and so forth, and they would love to keep the party going. In addition, there are residents and homeowners in a few neighborhoods that are, let's say, essentially pockets of resistance. So I think the sense is the logical thing will be to offer them early access to the city's new menu of zoning options so that they can customize and get their needs met without giving them veto power over the rest of the city.
That's a good point. I've been following particularly it seems that the Pacific Palisades, I think we've talked about them before, that they have a somewhat different mindset.
Yes, and in all fairness, that's not uniform throughout the Palisades, because I hear as well from folks in the Palisades who don't share that view. But they can sort that out in the way that all neighborhoods will be doing in the next few years, because the city is developing in parallel a whole menu of zoning options, and various neighborhoods will have to kind of caucus and figure out what suits them, and what is the consensus, or at any rate what is the majority, plurality. They'll figure it out. So we're saying, great, we need reform of the underlying foundational regulation, and that cannot and should not be pulled off course to satisfy the concerns of a very vocal minority.
Yeah, because there are so many. I was moved just what news accounts I read of the meeting this week, and a lot of the testimony for the people who support this reform of the baseline Mansionization Ordinance was frankly very emotional.
Yes.
These people have, you could feel their pain at what they've seen happen in their own neighborhoods. And
yeah, it was interesting because the council president kind of reminded everyone, we're not the enemy, we're trying to do the right thing. People are very impassioned. And I think it's partly because this has taken so very, very long. It is,
I think so. It's very frustrating.
If the city had moved with a little greater speed and resolve.
They've allowed this wound to fester.
Yeah.
And it's now become more of a painful process and more elaborate process in a way to try to effect a cure.
And more deeply damaging because, when this all started a long, long time ago, we used to say that they were houses like Hummers. But most of the Hummers are gone now. They're off the street.
That's true.
The houses not only are still there, they will be there for decades.
Yeah.
So an addendum to talking about the hearing itself, because that's what made such an impression.
Yeah, it was pretty emotional stuff to read.
It was, and I think the other thing is that it wasn't simply that it was emotional, but there was a consistent message that the commissioners heard about 50 times just Thursday afternoon. I'm not counting the correspondence that led up into the hearing. Something on the order of 50 citizens spent an entire day, as it turns out, because it was a marathon hearing, an entire day waiting to get their 60 seconds to speak to the commission. And they were very consistent and very clear on a couple of points. One is they absolutely wanted to stop mansionization, and the other was they specifically wanted the city to address the exemption relating to attached garages. And the first comment that came out of the commission president's mouth when they began deliberations was that testimony was overwhelming. I mention that because it is terrifically important for people to understand that all we have is our numbers.
Good point.
The developers and the realtors and the speculators have an inside track in a lot of ways. There's campaign funding, there's all kinds of things.
And they have a lot of backstage access.
A lot of backstage access. We have our numbers, but if they don't hear from us and they don't see us, we do not stand a chance. So we're heading into the part of the process that will probably be even more challenging.
That's what I wanted to ask about.
Right.
Because now when we get out of these appointed commissions, now we're getting into the council.
we're getting into the council, we're getting into elected officials,
Mhm.
and there are a lot of people who feel that elected officials often put the interests of the speculators and the developers ahead of the interests of the community. So we need to make ourselves heard. If they don't get a very, very strong message, they will run us right over.
Well, now you make a good point. You know, these 50 people that came down to the CPC meeting spent all day and got 1 minute of speaking time. Yet, in the aggregate, they created a hell of an effect.
They absolutely did. But I don't want anybody to sit home and think, oh, good, I'm glad there are those 50 people who will go
Yeah.
do it. I don't have to. Because guess what? Out of those 50 people, some of them next time are going to be out of town or have
Busy.
conflicting commitments
Yeah.
or whatever. We all need to step up.
But the point being is that even if you only get to speak for 1 minute, if there's enough of you, you
Right.
can make a difference.
Right.
And a lot of times, and I get it, I've been downtown plenty of times, and you think, oh, wow, just schlepp down there, I gotta park, I gotta go there. Sometimes they're delayed or they're addressing other matters, and you're sitting in those pews they have in those meeting rooms, and but it does make a difference.
It does absolutely make a difference.
So obviously now you have to rally the forces for the testimony and the public
Right.
comments to the council's planning and land
Right.
use.
They need to hear by email before, and they need to see people there in place. That's very powerful. Now, for the developers and the realtors, this is their business. So this isn't taking time away from their business.
They're
This is
paid
what
to
they
do this, yeah. Yeah.
For the rest of us, we're taking time away from all of our other commitments and our professional and personal and whatever it is. It's a big ask. But, you know, that's it. If you care about mansionization in Los Angeles, the city has to hear from you and they have to see you. And even if you're not living in a single family zone, and this change may not immediately and directly apply to you, it's worth remembering that this is going to set the foundation and set the tone for a lot of other issues that are coming up very much on the heels that have to do with overdevelopment in the city of Los Angeles.
It's a hot topic.
It's a hot topic, and we need to get a stake in the ground.
Do you have a feeling, an instinct or about the city council's planning and land use committee? What you're going to encounter there? What kind of support or non-support? Or am I putting you on the spot?
You are indeed.
Yeah.
We will hope for the best. We will
Keep a
plan
positive
for the worst.
attitude. Yeah.
Right?
Okay, that's fair. I'll accept that answer.
Okay.
We'll expand on that in our next
Okay.
episode. Typically, so now once it goes through the Planning and Land Use Committee of the City Council, then the environmental impact report
Right.
has to happen.
And of course, at various junctures, the city attorney has to review. And
Yes,
right,
and
make
they have to
sure
do some ordinance
Right.
writing and make everything conform. Well, you know, I ask you this every time. What do you think the timeline is? When would you ideally like to be at the city council for the vote?
Yesterday.
I know, 8 years ago. What do you think?
Well, I am told that Plum will be at the earliest next month,
Okay.
sometime. Certainly by the end of this calendar year, we would like to get this thing across the finish line. The sooner, the better, no question about that. And the various neighborhoods that have interim ordinances that give them short-term protection of greater or lesser
Yeah.
quality, we'll see those regulations expire in March. So we really need to get this thing.
Yes, and I think that will help. The fact that there is a drop dead date on the ICOs, of which the Miracle Mile has one.
Right.
And the ICOs prohibit demolition for McMansions unless they subscribe to your neighborhood's reduced floor area
Right.
formulas.
You know, and the city planners have a lot of other stuff to do. It's not like they need to make work. There's
I
a
interviewed
ton.
Ken Bernstein just last week
Uh-huh.
on managing all the HPOZs. It's
Oh, not just that, but I mean,
Yeah.
they're essentially rewriting the city code. It's
Recode
huge.
LA,
Recode
and
LA.
then we've got the Build Better LA initiative coming up in November. We've got the Neighborhood Integrity Initiative coming up. That's in March, isn't it?
I
The next
believe so. I
municipal
think
election?
that's the plan, yeah.
Yeah, I don't think either one of us realized that we were starting a mini-series when we began this. We just, the plot keeps
Well,
thickening.
I think you're gonna have to write my character out at some
I
point.
know. Well, we'll think of something,
Okay.
Nick. You know, it'll be a cliffhanger.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Shelley.
Thank you, Ken.
Bye-bye.